me when you see me come and make some room. Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tip top of the world.
We're back again, and we are still talking about the International Longshoremen's Association and the U.S. Maritime Alliance negotiation. A little qualifier, we are pre-recording today. We have a special guest on this week. So this is being recorded on a Thursday afternoon. This is a very fluid situation. So in case this comes out after a potential agreement, who knows, right? Anything could happen at any time. The things that we're talking about today are still going to be relevant. So today we have a very special guest on. We've had him on before, and we're making an effort to have more guests on. But today we're going to be having Dr. Sal Mercogliano join us. He is the host of What's Going On with Shipping. He's a maritime historian, and he is probably the most popular guy in all of maritime these days. Certainly he knows the most on the most amount of topics. So we got a great show for you today. Stick around. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies. And I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there's no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So usually we go through our top 3 stories of the week, but we have a special guest today. Let's jump right into it. Dr. Sal Mercogliano is joining us. Hi, Sal. Welcome to the show.
Lauren, it's so good to be with you. I always think when we do these together, we should change this from the Maritime Professor to the Maritime Professors. That should be us.
Yeah, the Maritime Academy.
There you go. We're all set to go. Lauren, I don't know why you brought me on. There's nothing going on. It's the quietest week ever in maritime. I mean, there's nothing going on with shipping it. Holy cow, Lauren. I mean, even if everything gets resolved today, there's so many other things going on that you and I can talk forever. We have everyone who's watching. You should have seen like the talk before the video where we were just talking about everything.
And we always nerd out on FMC, right? That's a special passion of mine. It's a special interest of yours. You know, I think that we could probably, and we will be talking a lot about the Federal Maritime Commission during this time today. But I mean, your video coming out that you had of the Houthis, we were talking before the show. What a wild glimpse into pre-attack and then attack. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate that you bring to your channel is this attention to the mariners, right? The mariners that are out there that are just getting caught in the crossfires. They have nothing to do with this. And your point on these are innocent workers out there risking their lives. Maritime mariners are one of the most risky jobs in all the world. And certainly during COVID, it was such a difficult time too, because to be at the same spot for the 2-dose vaccine for a mariner, it is almost impossible, right? And so there's unique challenges to merchant mariners and mariners across the board, across the world. And so I appreciate your mentioning of that during your videos.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, in that video I did on that attack, it was an attack on a ship called the Cordelia Moon, was, you know, the part that gets me most about that attack isn't so much, you know, it's a very dramatic attack. You see the boat coming in, there's an explosion, but it's the fear in their voices are running the moment before the attack comes. And they're just, you know, they're running for their lives. And then they're dealing with the damage of the ship and just, you know, the horror that they experience on a daily day, you know, and even when we talk about the strike going on, I've gotten notes from ILA workers, you know, and it's like, yeah, you can show Harold Daggett and his house and it's beautiful. He goes, but I'm an ILA worker. He goes, it takes me 6 years to get up to be a full-time ILA worker. He goes, it's 10 years till I qualify for full benefits. He goes, I'm working through the system now, but I'm doing DoorDash to make things work. So when they talk about 6 figures, yeah, I'll eventually be able to make that, but I'm nowhere near that. And by the way, I'm going to have to work an extra 20 to 30 hours a week to get that money. So, you know, it's just putting a little bit of context in there, I think, is really important. I've been spending a little bit of time talking about who the ILA is, who the U.S. Maritime Alliance is. You know, so, you know, whatever I can do, I try to do. And I appreciate you. You're very kind to say those things.
No, well, and when we had the ILWU, the West Coast Union negotiations, I think at that time, actually, one of the comments on one of your YouTube videos on what's going on with shipping came down and talked about, there was a report saying all these overly inflated salaries. One, they're not salary, they're hourly, right? And so there's certain benefits that are otherwise usually associated with salary that aren't necessarily there. And it is incredibly dangerous work. I mean, let's not forget that it is, you don't survive. I keep saying you don't survive from a container falling on you, right? So, I mean, just having that alone is significant.
No, one of the things we kind of talked about is I think the ILA's messaging strategy is a very weird one, but in some ways it's effective because you get Harold Daggett, and Harold Daggett is central casting for a union boss. If I told Hollywood, get me a union boss for this, it's Harold Daggett. He's great. He's great. He gets the attention. But in his quote unquote candid conversation he did a few weeks ago, there was really good information in there, and I thought it was really important. And one of the things he talked about was port safety and the safety of the personnel in there. And he talked about that automation issue. ILWU and the PMA, dealt with this issue of automation. We've got 3 yards out on the West Coast. You've got LBCT, you got TrayPack, and then you have APM, which is the Maersk terminal came in, and they lost jobs. I mean, there was 500 to 800 jobs that were lost in those areas. And again, it's not that you get more efficiency out of the port. It's not like, LBCT does move more containers, but they also are a much more expanded container terminal than they want. It just removes the workers from it. It's not like it saves you money. It doesn't save you money because the automation is expensive. Everything you need is expensive. But you can work 24/7. What changes those terminals is they're pitch black at night, and they're working, because it's, but even if you work, you can't even work 24/7 in a US port because you can't get a trucker to come get the container because the warehouses are closed. That was the thing we talked about back when we had the West Coast going on. It's like, we'll go 24/7. It's like, that doesn't work. It's like, you've got to be 24/7 everywhere, and that's not going to work.
Exactly. It's a supply chain ecosystem. And I think that's of all the bad things that happened during COVID, I think that's the silver lining, is that it really started to break down the silos between that otherwise barrier of a port gate, right? You had the surface transportation not understanding the ocean side, and the ocean side not understanding the surface. And all of a sudden you had shippers and BCOs who wanted to know what happened on the other side of the gate. And so 24-hour gate access, like you said, doesn't matter if you don't have the rest of the ecosystem prepared for that. And so that's certainly part of the problem there. So before we get,
I've talked about this for a long time. It's like I owe Craig Fuller money for like my PhD in trucking and rail because I knew shipping, but in truth I didn't quite understand that aspect, and it is so essential, and that's why what you do is so important because you talk about that.
Agreed. And same thing, right? I come from the ocean side of things, having worked at the Federal Maritime Commission, that's where I know. And so I called this by land and by sea so that I could bring in that surface transportation and try to break down that otherwise barrier of the port gate. But before we get too far into it, I know that my followers, your followers know what's going on, but let's make sure I always try to do that, make sure that everybody knows what's going on as we dive into the topics. So let's kind of set the stage here, right? What are we talking about? What's the larger issue that we're talking about? Well, if you haven't watched the news all week, I mean, maybe there's one person who doesn't totally know, but what are we talking about? We have the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, representing the dock workers at ports all along the East Coast and Gulf Coast. And that's important to designate between the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, which is the West Coast. That's what we talked about last year. This year, we're talking about the ILA. They have a long history of advocating for fair wages, safe working conditions, and better benefits for its members. And they are in their, well, now expired, otherwise 6-year contract of a master contract with the United States Maritime Alliance, or the USMX. That alliance represents the port operators, the terminal companies, and the ocean carriers who use these vital ports for shipping goods. And so without the contract in place, it was long known, at least certainly I think into the spring or early summer, that the ILA would not continue to work past an expiration of the contract. And so while this actual strike happening was a surprise, the only surprise is that it actually happened. It was not a surprise that it was a possibility. And I think that's what makes this situation much different than COVID, is we were able to prepare as a supply chain by moving out those yards, by clearing out those terminals, and making sure that we were able to be in the best position possible for when the ships come back, right? COVID shut down. You couldn't organize, and then the ships come back. And I think that's where we have our next critical point here, is what happens when those ships come back. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about these key issues behind the strike. We're already starting to talk about automation. What else are we talking about here? We start talking about the salaries, the wage gaps. Part of the messaging, and I think this is what you've talked about in your show, I've certainly talked about in mine, is the messaging that's coming out is a little bit unreliable, because you can almost see the negotiations taking place on the media stand, right? And so you're hearing, I don't want to call them overinflated, but perhaps a little bit higher than what they're actually looking for on both sides, because they're trying to use that as negotiating power. And also, I think that's the difficult part of this whole thing, is getting a real handle on it, because you don't really know what's going on in the really intricate small group that is having those conversations.
I think there's a couple elements there. I think number one, both sides benefit from a strike, and I think most people don't understand that. I think the ILA, and I was here in June. In June was, ILA were having meetings with their members, telling them to store up, get ready, don't buy anything, don't get yourself in a position come October where you're going to be in a precarious position, because get ready, because this is coming. And ILA, Harold Daggett, again, right out of Central Casting, but he knew he wanted to make this point. And I think the Maritime Alliance, which is a really interesting entity, again, let's talk about that. It's the port, it is the stevedoring companies, and it's the big shipping companies. And you look at that board of directors, 13 members on that board of directors, 8 of them represent foreign companies. The irony of the strike always is that you have the international longshoremen who represent American workers, and you have the U.S. Maritime Alliance, which largely represents foreign corporations.
That's a good point.
They both are first of all benefiting. We're going to talk about the shipping lines and the surcharges we're getting ready to see be charged. But it's higher freight rates. It's going to be a lot of things that they're going to be able to get in this. They have that dogging issue of overcapacity. We've seen this spike back up in their profits because of the Red Sea diversion, and now we have a potential to see that here. The ILA is arguing, the two issues is wages and automation. They're obviously concerned about that. They don't want to see their wages, the argument has been, well, the Maritime Alliance was at the table. The ILA walked away. Well, the agreement that was on the table was 2 years ago. I mean, again, this is the most white swan event we can have. It's not a black swan. We knew this was happening. We knew in 2018, it's like, okay, September 30th, 2024, this ends. We need to be ready for this. And, the ILA said 2 years ago, it's like, we're not going to accept 22%. Because if you're back in 2022, let's be clear, you're looking at the shipping companies making record profits. I mean, I understand in 2018, and if you look at when they negotiated in 2018 was a dark year. I mean, it was half in the red, half in the black. You'd had up and down years, going back to 2008, and then 2015. You had a whole batch of years, and you would never make a 77% ask for salary at that time. But in 2021, the shipping companies made more profit than they did in the decade before combined. And then in 22, they made even more. And it's like, the ILA is like, okay, where's our part of this? You're offering 22%. You won't negotiate. I'm not going to be at the table. And what we saw is on the eve of the strike, the Maritime Alliance came out with a paper, basically a press release that said, we're willing to go to 50%. We're willing. What they agreed in that statement was amazing. I know it's not what the ILA said, but it was 50%. It was 3 years or 3 times the matching going into retirement funds. It was increased health payments and health care. And the biggest statement I saw in there was they agreed to talk and stabilize automation and semi-automation. You could have won the ILA on that right there. But I think they wanted the press. They wanted the story. They wanted to show that they were willing to walk out. And to me, that's what Daggett represents. He's willing to go out there and push it to the limit and make it that level. And then, then you get the response from the administration. The Biden comes out and says, we will not negotiate, or we're not going to intercede. We're not going to invoke Taft-Hartley. I'm not Bush. We're not going to do 2002 with the PMA and the ILWU. You get Secretary Sue coming out, the acting Secretary of Labor. You get Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation, come out. Bad comment from the Secretary of Commerce, but everyone else was kind of good. And it's a very advantageous position. I don't think this goes very long. When this comes out, I'm going to say we're getting close to an agreement. They may run it for a news cycle or two over the weekend, but I think they're close. But what's going to be really interesting is the fallout, because you and I both know that once you close the port, and this happened beforehand, we already saw it happening because we were front loading cargo into the East and Gulf Coast, shifting cargo to the West Coast. This is going to cause global delays. We've already seen cargo I had somebody call me the other day saying my cargo is dumped in the Bahamas. How am I supposed to get cargo from the Bahamas here? And it's going to be dumped everywhere. There's going to be literally American containers littering the globe. And it's going to take months to reset this.
Yeah. Well, even when Hanjin went bankrupt, talking about the carriers in right, the 2010s, when Hanjin went bankrupt, I mean, up until maybe a few years ago, you were still finding empty, deserted Hanjin containers out there in the wild. So, and that was one specific company. Now you're going to have, like you're saying, the American cargo kind of out there. There were a few things that you talked about. You said June was when the kind of forethinking started to come. Perhaps the ILA was telling its members, hey, get ready. The significance of June was that was when the last formal discussions happened, right? And so knowing that June was when they last sat down, and at that point, going after the Mobile, Alabama semi-automated gates, which wasn't necessarily a new tech or even like a new thing, right?
It wasn't new. It's been there for a while. That's like finding out there's gambling going on in this establishment. I'm shocked all of a sudden. It's like okay.
Exactly. Well, and then you talk about the retirement funds and the automation. That's part of what's happening here too. Is right. You have this whole slew of retirees from the ILA who the association has to also support, and so the automation attacks the potential jobs for the current workers, but then also attacks the potential funding of the association to cover the retirement funds. You talked about that a little bit on one of your shows as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the ILA is in a very unique position. I mean, ports on the East and Gulf Coast were huge for a long time, and Daggett says he resists automation. And remember, the biggest technological shift that happened was containerization. Period. Stop. End of sentence. That was the biggest thing. It basically unemployed massive amounts of the ILA because you weren't doing break bulk cargo anymore. And so, they're dealing with a retired base that's really large. One of the things I'd love to get into is the numbers of the ILA is, okay, how many members you have? What kind of money do you have put aside? How's your management been going with your retirement funds? That, because it doesn't sound like you've been doing very well with that retirement fund budget, because if you need more money coming in from members, all of that is a key thing. And, he's got to be very careful. I mean, he sees what happens if he loses. I mean, we're talking about thousands of members of the ILA. It used to be hundreds of thousands. And, you start automating yards, you lose 500 to 800 people in a pop. And that's a big problem for them. It's one of the reasons why we saw on the West Coast during the height of the COVID crisis, the supply chain crisis, the ILW would not bring on new members. It's like, we can't afford to bring on new members. I know you want us to put new members into the yard and move more cargo faster, but we can't, because then they become members and we're required to take care of them and pay into their retirement. And we don't need the retirees. We got to manage this. And that's why I think the issue right now, I think is this automation issue. They've got to do it. You can't resist it. I know Daggett says he doesn't want automation, but there's got to be an element in there where they talk about it, because but the key thing is the phase. How do you phase in automation, especially when you're operating on 6-year contracts? Because it's such a big gap between these contracts, because they didn't want shorter contracts for fear that they're always negotiating. Right. And so they want longer contracts, but now the technology is such that you're seeing automation come in. And again, automation isn't the end all be all. It's a really expensive proposal to come in and automate. Where we see automation worldwide, Jean-Paul Rodrigue, who's the master of port economics, sent me a note. He says about worldwide, we're looking at about 7.6% of the world's terminals are automated. Because everyone highlights Shanghai and Rotterdam, but in truth, most ports aren't. I mean, they're nowhere near that. So the U.S. is not, unusual in this. It takes a lot to bring it in. It's a huge investment cost, and that's something the shipping companies aren't always interested in doing either.
That's right. That's right. Well, and even getting Wi-Fi on the yard, right? I mean, that's like it's a very paper-based industry to begin with, and so of course, it's kind of there's a podcast out there, The Last Remaining Dinosaur, right? Because this industry really is very, very paper-based for good or for bad. I mean, and so to start there, right? How much paper do you use in your regular day? Of course, most people are using emails. I mean, they're posting their things on Facebook, which you're not getting from a written word that you're sending by carrier pigeon to somebody, right? So there's already a form of technology integrated, and I think for the benefit, and it's striking that balance, right? And we as a nation will need to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit faster, and perhaps a little bit more tech forward, but not at the cost of the American worker. And I think that really is the crux of the conversation here on, now that it's garnered some national attention, the national stage as well. The in general, though, so coming from COVID, right? It was a wild time. But remember, those first few days and weeks and months were particularly scary because of the unknown. And it was right around maybe 2021 that I started saying, I think we're going to see the rise of the union, or of the employee, the essential employee, because you're going to start to see these contracts expire, and not just the profits that were made in this specific industry, but I think the larger thing, and I teach a class called organizational behavior, and it kind of gets into the psyche, the psychology, if you will, of kind of an organization. And we use the case study of the ILW and the ILA as, what else are they asking for here? This is their first chance to have the conversation of how the COVID experience was for them. And like we said from the outset, this is an incredibly dangerous job. And then to add in, you're afraid of a container falling on you, and now to add in, you might get sick, really sick, from the guy sitting next to you. That creates a different level of an already difficult time, right? Those first few weeks and months of COVID, when you didn't really know what was happening. I mean, we were afraid to go outside, right? I mean, so that I think is also playing into the psyche here. And we saw that with the ILWU contract negotiation of the Heroes Fund, right? The one-time payment of the thank you. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something along those lines. It certainly isn't the height of the topic, because here we are 4 years from the start, well, 4+ years from the start of COVID. But that's also, I think, playing into the more we're seeing the heightened conversations around some of these contract negotiations.
Oh, I think so. I mean, you kind of heard it from Daggett when they brought on the container royalties, because some of that money goes to a very similar style fund for them. And one of the things that gets me about this too is this strike takes place in the backdrop of some very tenuous labor negotiations. We're talking about the ILWU, but let's not forget we had UAW, we had Teamsters, you got Boeing. There was been a lot of union things going on. And one of the things that the ILA really represented is a national union. I mean, it really was. I mean, I had people telling me it's like Houston dock workers aren't going to go on strike. It's Texas. It's a right to work state. It's like, no, they're going. It's like, I don't care if it's a right to work state. The docks are unionized. And a few years ago, I don't think Daggett's able to drag Texas local and even South Carolina's local, which have been fighting over, the Leatherman terminal down there for a long time, in this. But he had the locals in line. He really did. And we keep forgetting it's not Daggett that dragged them into the strike. It is the membership who voted. It's he may be local, vocal, and loud, but it's the locals that voted for this. And they represent a coherent opposition against things like the U.S. Maritime Alliance, which is representing, the top 10 container liners in the world control 85% of the container capacity out there in 3 or 4 alliances, wherever we're at right now, in this structure. Meanwhile, the flip side of that always to me is that idea of trucking in the U.S. 85% of trucking in the U.S. is a company that has 1 to 6 trucks. And it's the exact opposite. Back in the 70s and 80s, you had the strong trucking. You had that big unified trucking. And in many ways, what ILA represented here was this kind of coherent front. And Daggett's mad about that. He's mad about the fact that his workers were showing up on the piers during COVID, that they deemed essential workers, that they were doing a lot of risks. And let's be clear, even if you automate a port, you don't remove ILA workers, because someone's got to climb on that ship and throw lashings on and off in the heat down in Houston or freezing up in Boston. Somebody has to do that, and it is extremely dangerous work. And there's still jobs that have to be done. I think the biggest issue they have got to get into is how you phase automation in so that you protect the current workers, and at the same time, the ILA is going to have to bring in new workers. There's going to be maintenance for those automated container movers. There's got to be, data processors. There's got to be a lot of other jobs out there. And, if I'm worried about automation, I see those control panels they have where people work in a port. I want to make sure that's in the port. I won't want it being in India. I don't want it being overseas because it could happen. And that's the fear they have.
That's right. And even, talking about the technology and the automation side of it, even manually typing in container numbers versus QAing container numbers. Who actually wants to be typing in all those different characters, making sure, did I get it right? Right. Like that can be a little tedious as an experience of a worker, but instead being kind of QAing, that it's a similar job, but perhaps a little bit of a more enjoyable thing. But that's part of the conversation, I'm sure, that's taking place there. So you mentioned the Global Ocean Shipping Alliance, or the global alliances, these vessel sharing agreements. Let's stop there for a minute, because I think that they also get, perhaps, I don't hate the alliances. I think that the alliances serve a very important purpose. And the same way that you bring up trucking and the concentration that happens during the 2010, 2015 time period, when everything was downturning and you had vessels that were half loaded, they were all kind of going to the same place, and it's unsustainable. And so now, as we know, you start seeing better routing options, right? You start seeing some of them working together for vessel sharing, but they're still competing with each other for the actual business. They still want it being shipped under their own company. And so the vessels that are part of the alliance aren't a full array of their entire vessel fleet. It's a portion of their vessel fleet. And so to say, that it really is a concentration is opposite, and actually prevents, I would argue, that concentration, because had they all gone out of business and bought each other out, we would only have 2 or 3 companies. Instead, we have 9 or 10 companies with 2 or 3 3 or 4 vessel sharing agreements. And so I think that we still benefit as kind of the users of the supply chain generally by keeping it in the alliance structure with some checks, right? And so that's where our conversation to the Federal Maritime Commission starts to come in.
Right. And one of the things that really amazed me in this discussion is, let me be clear. I agree with you. The maritime alliances and the global shipping companies, you can talk about big bad companies, everything. They have given us prosperity in many ways. The freight rates we get, the ability to move goods, is only possible because what we have right now. And it was moving from that for a long time. And they are not the bad. There's no bad guys or good guys in this scenario. They're just competing parties in here. What I was really interested in is, you hear a lot from the government side on the support of the ILA, but, there was some leverage. And I think they missed an opportunity here to call in some of the shipping firms, call in those CEOs, bring them in and to go, I think nothing more than Roland Saad or Aponte or the CEO of Maersk, Vincent Clark, would love is to get a call from the White House and say, hey, I want you to come here and let's talk and let's settle this down, because that gives them gravitas, makes them look important. It raises them up. And, for the shipping companies, this is a rounding error. This is not enough money that's going to be an issue for them. But I think there is an opportunity. And plus, you do have the leverage to sit there and say, listen, there's a lot of antitrust issues going on. Let's talk. You do have a little bit of leverage there to kind of, let's get the negotiating going. Let's and that could have been done behind the scenes before October 1st, and very visible. And I think, but that goes to visibility. Does the government understand how the shipping industry works, and understand the who are the big players here? Because you make fun of Daggett and his house and the money he gets and everything, but it's a drop in the bucket and to Aponte and the Mediterranean Shipping Company and the yachts and houses and jets he has. So, I think that's a context that's really important. And again, that's where FMC comes in many ways. Should have been, I think that's an element there where they know how to kind of apply leverage, because with the new powers given to them under Ocean Shipping Reform Act and more people, they have a lot more visibility of that.
Yeah, but and to be fair, right? So certainly family-owned companies, right, and the CEOs at the top. But I just go back, like, nobody thought that the companies could go out of business, and yet 2014, right, Hanjin went down, it went bankrupt, and that was, partially supported by the country itself.
Yep.
And so, it's possible it happens. And the fact that freight rates, like a normal freight rate, on a pre-COVID normal year, it's like $1,200, right, from Asia to West Coast, or maybe no longer, right? Now it's certainly raising, but like that is so cheap. And so you can ship an entire TEU, 20-foot equivalent unit, for $1,200 or previously, right? I mean, it jumped up to 20,000 potentially during COVID. There's been some wild numbers thrown around these days. I'm not sure that we're seeing anywhere near that on the East Coast right now. But I mean, so it costs a lot for these vessels to operate. It costs a lot for all of the new environmental regulations that are being put on the fleets. And so there's a balance. I mean, you're talking in big numbers, but those big numbers, have big risk to them as well. And so
And I would argue that's where the Maritime Alliance really fell down on their, because I can make the argument very well that, listen, we had to buy a new fleet. I mean, we literally were facing this issue of IMO 2020. We're facing IMO 2050. We're the ones who are investing in new technology. You want us to be cleaner. We literally have to replace our entire fleet of vessels because they're not going to be able to operate under CII and all the regulations that are there. So yeah, we made a lot of money, but we're also spending a lot of money to get our new ships up so that they can be the cleanest method of doing it. Again, both sides, I think just it's a lessons learned here in how to articulate and how to discuss things, because you can point at both sides and find problems without a doubt.
that's right. And there's definitely more information. I mean, you have the attention of the American public and hopefully, on the larger global scale. And so perhaps this is an education moment, right? I mean,
That's
to
what I
kind of
was going
educate
for.
more. Yeah, right. To kind of have more of those conversations of, well, what else are either the maritime workforce under pressure for, and what else are the ship owners under pressure for? So, I don't want to go too far into this, but the FMC also had this 2015 congestion report. It was almost a playbook. We've brought it up many times before, a playbook for what congestion looks like and what we're about to see, right? Equipment shortages. They talked about all of these things in 2015. So if you haven't seen that, that's the Federal Maritime Commission released a port congestion study in 2015 before everything kind of hit the fan. But what was going on during that 2015 time period that would kind of predicate that report? We haven't really talked about that side of things.
Well, I mean, you saw 2008, you obviously have the global recession. All of a sudden, you had reduction in fleets. The ocean shipping companies were bleeding money. Bleeding money. This is where they got rid of their container fleets. They got rid of terminals. They were just doing everything they could to try to literally stay afloat. It created a lot of problems for them. And then, you had Maersk, who had just all of a sudden introduced the new, the Triple E was coming in, these new, big, huge vessels, economy vessels were coming in. The plan was to build bigger and bigger to lower costs. And we're going to be much more efficient in doing it. And, you look at those profitabilities during that period of time, and it's like a flat line of a patient, it's like, it's not good,
Kind of
it's
dropped
like,
a few. The patient died a couple times.
it's down, it's up, but it's nowhere. It's like bouncing between zero, and it's like, this is not good. That was a terrible time to be investing in container companies. A terrible time to be in a container company. I know we're talking about record profits now, but man, it was the exact opposite. It was a terrible period. And as you mentioned, we had the concept of bankruptcy of Hanjin it shattered everyone's imaginations. We're talking about the sixth or seventh largest container line in the world. You got to go back to U.S. lines going out in '84 to find anything close to that. But the companies were so much different, 2 decades later. This is a major carrier supported by the Korean government. Everybody expected the Korean government to come in and intercede. We'd seen basically alliances form. The original concept of alliances, you and I know this, back in the 90s, were for the small companies to be able to compete against bigger companies. So you got a couple of small companies together. You got a vessel sharing agreement. You can maybe stand up with the likes of Sealand or Maersk or one of the big ones. But then all of a sudden we saw kind of musical chairs after 2008. It was like, okay, let's form alliances. And if you look at those graphs and who's in what alliance, it's like everybody's moving around. And I always use the analogy that a Hanjin was the last player out when the music stopped and there was no chair for them. And they were kind of found themselves in a really bad kind of position to be in. And what we saw was the bankruptcy of a line. You had 94 ships floating on the high seas. They told some of their ships not to come into port for fear they're going to be arrested. And as you mentioned, it created havoc across the board. And I remember a conversation right after that. And I said, oh, companies are going to buy up those ships. And it's like, oh, no one's going to buy those ships. And they bought them up in no time. They just, it was the companies eating their own. It was like they were going to kind of consume their own. But as you mentioned, it created for us the situation we were. I think that the thing that we tend to focus on in the supply chain is, wow, there were 109 ships off of Long Beach in LA. And it's like there wasn't a shipping shortage. You know that, right? We had 109 ships. They came from somewhere. We had plenty of ships. What broke down is, as we talked about, was the infrastructure to be able to handle that much coming into the port at one time. And I was always, I've told you this many times, I was fascinated reading that report at the time. It's like, holy cow, this is the playbook for what happened in 2020. It's like Mercogliano had everything figured out. It's like this is exactly what happened.
Mhm.
And my fear is we really haven't learned a lot from that, because when I hear people sitting there saying, well, we'll just shift to the West Coast, it's like the West Coast hasn't fixed everything that's there. We learned some lessons. I think one of the things that makes this different today is that we've seen a lot of shippers diversify. They're not 100% coming into LA and Long Beach. They have the capability to go into multiple ports. The months before this are the most interesting to me, because when you looked at the amount of containers coming in, you looked at record numbers into LA and Long Beach. It's like, okay, people have learned. They know what's happening here. They're moving cargo. They're shifting where their ports come in. They're front loading as much as they can, which you can't do in manufacturing, because things are being produced and manufactured, on assembly lines and coming out as quick as they're done. But there was a lot of lessons that were learned, and it's really interesting that it is the shippers that are learning that a lot more. Now, there's going to be a lot of low to medium-sized businesses who don't have that kind of visibility and realize, and their stuff is sitting on a ship that's going to be queued off of Savannah now for a week or two, even if this port strike ends. It's going to take a while, because we know every day you have congestion, it's going to take about a week to clear the backlog behind it. And this issue is global. You're talking about a quarter of the world's containers heading into the east and Gulf Coast of the United States. And what we're seeing right now is containers dumping all over the planet.
Yeah. No, it's, you mentioned two things there, the diversification of entry and I would also argue what we learned from COVID congestion was the preparation, right? We knew that this was a possibility. And so it became that hedging of bets. Do you start front loading cargo into the ports early, especially for the perishable things that can be frozen? Do you bring those in early, but then you start running out of cold storage space or that sort of thing? And then the other thing, kind of bringing it full circle to the beginning, there's only so much of the ecosystem available once you actually hit the inland portion, right? You can bring it in, but there's only so much warehouse space. There's only so much, like I said, cold storage or storage in general. And certainly container boxes, if they're inland, then they're tied up, right? Chassis are now tied up because they're underneath the box, and the chassis obviously is the wheels that make that box move. So I think that's something that we did learn from the COVID congestion years, was to prepare a little bit when you can, so that you're not caught flat-footed. But the hedging of the bets is, well, how long does this go on? And so I think the vessel owners are in that predicament now. Do you keep the vessels offshore waiting, hoping that it's less than 2 weeks? And I feel like most of the messaging I've heard and most of the feelings that the whispers, if you will, have been less than 2 weeks, right? I think that's what everybody's really hoping for and planning for. If it goes much beyond that, you have to start making decisions. What do you do with those vessels offshore? What do you do with the mariners, right? They're stuck. We come back to the mariners kind of getting the raw end here, that they're stuck on these vessels.
It is Ever Given. When Ever Given gets stuck in the Suez, and ships kept going to Suez. I mean, they were piling up north and south. I think we had about 450 ships anchored there, because it was 6 days stuck in the canal, and so ships are sitting there going, "Do I go around?" It's like, well, if I go around now and it clears, I'm going to miss the opportunity to go through. But there is a point. There's a breaking point. And with Ever Given, we were figuring 2 weeks. If it went 2 weeks, that was going to be maybe 10 days. People, we already saw some ships start to divert around, but not enough. But it was going to be a breaking point when all of a sudden it's like, okay, even if they clear it, I'm going to be in such a line, it's going to take me so long to get through. Same thing on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. You've got the queues forming up. We see them off Savannah, Charleston, New York, and Houston right now. But right now they're not too bad. They're not too bad, and everyone's going to be able to clear those fairly quick, because we get those peaks and troughs. I mean, the good thing too here is when this is happening, we're coming in the last quarter. This tends to be, October is usually a big month, but I think everything went forward pretty much on this. So what we usually tend to see is down months coming into November and December. So it's not too bad. The thing I get concerned about more than anything else is this is taking containers out of the system. We're not flowing empties out, and we saw this when the Houthi attacked. When the Houthi attacked, and you created the initial diversion around Africa, what you saw is a massive spike in freight rates. Everybody panicked. But then it came down and everyone's like, oh, this is good. Everything's getting back to normal then. Then we saw it go back up again, and it went up higher, twice as high as it did prior to that. And that was the long-term impact hitting the system of all of a sudden the global disruption. And now what we've seen is it's progressing downward again, kind of normalizing, which is, everything's getting back into, what is a new quote unquote norm. That's what we're going to have here. We're going to see, I expect to see, rates spike. We're going to see a big, huge jump in rates spike all of a sudden. And then it's going to kind of settle back down. But then the long-term impacts are going to come in. If you don't have containers leaving the United States this month in October, those containers are not going to be in East Asia in November, which means that they're not loading, which means they're not prepared for the new year when Q1 kicks around, and all of a sudden you start having that big spike before the Chinese New Year, that you got to get everything shipped because you're going to lose something, and you're going to lose a week in February. And again, that's that visibility. That's the impact this has. You would think, I used an analogy the other day, and somebody, all of a sudden, I think it triggered in them, is like, remember when the airports closed down and everybody got stuck and everywhere like that? How long did it take to sort that out? It's like, if you were stuck in the airport in Atlanta, did you just go rent a car? It's like, no, there are no rental cars left. I couldn't go anywhere. It's like, I couldn't get out of Atlanta, which is a nightmare. And now, people are seeing that on a shipping scale.
That's right. Well, and so what happens next, right? Even if they come to an agreement right now, and maybe even before this video airs, even if that happens, we still have quite a bit ahead of us. And one thing that I've been advising my clients is just keep meticulous records, right? Because we all know the story as it's happening in real time, but how does that apply to your goods, your shipment? How does, the charges are kind of their applications are very, all of this is so nuanced that you have to really pay attention and be able to tell that story afterwards. Hopefully we learn something about detention, demurrage, and surcharges generally from COVID congestion, and how to keep good records there. So that way, when we do have the congestion of the ships coming in, we can be prepared for it. We can be ready for it. And as the shippers, the better prepared they are, I think the less inflation, hopefully they can maybe hedge against that inflation. But as the American economy is reliant on these goods coming in, right? I mean, 80 to 90% of everything moves by ocean transit.
Well, and as well as I do, the FMC are still dealing with the issues left over from the supply chain crisis. This is going to add a whole new dimension to this, because we're seeing, the shipping companies are putting out the notices, the surcharges are out there. Some of them are excessively high, and we think they're going high for a reason. They can always ratchet them back down again, but they got to put the 30-day notices out. They're hedging their bets in some ways, and it's going to take a while to reset everything. And there's going to be claims. Do you have is this force majeure if you're the operating company and you're not negotiating? I mean, I can make that argument. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's like you didn't negotiate the contract. You can't declare force majeure. If you finally agree to what the union wanted, then you were the one holding it up. It's like, why am I paying for that? There's a tension in the yards. Wait a minute, I can't access it because you guys aren't working. How are you charging me for above my 9-day, free time period that I'm going there? And at the same time, too, let's be clear. Some of the terminals are loving this, because if you're LA and Long Beach, you're like, oh man, come on back, baby. It's like it's golden time. You got Gene and Mario in LA and Long Beach, and they're going, hey, we got capacity. We're at 70% operating capacity. Come on back to Southern California.
That's right. And some of the diversion that happened from the ILWU conversations and negotiations that moved it to the East Coast might be on its way back.
Let's be 100% clear here. New York, New Jersey, and a lot of the ports on the East Coast were loving the issue on the West Coast, and they're like, come to the East Coast. We got you. And so, it's that kind of competition. And again, it's really interesting about the terminal and port competitions, because those are local based. They tend to be, very much state or municipal ports. And then we have the operating terminals who lease from them. And, it's a lot of competition. And this is one of the arguments, too, that the ILA makes, is like, listen, we represent the ports entirely. We represent all the ports. We're one of the few united fronts here, that because let's not forget, when Daggett went on strike October 1st, the guy standing right next to him was the president of the ILWU. I mean, so that was a pretty unified front right there. We had the Teamsters come out with a very interesting letter telling the government what to do. I mean, it's a really interesting time for labor. I do think you're right. I think labor is in one of these kind of interesting revitaling periods, and because people have a knee-jerk reaction against unions, but if the unions get what they want here, if they get the 77% raise, people can go, wait, why don't I have a union? I can use this. I can use a 77% raise. I don't know about you, Lauren. I could use one.
The Maritime Professors Union. I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and coming back to the competition piece, right? So it can feel a little bit like, oh gosh, well, so these alliances are forming. There's cooperation there. The ports are working together. That's the really good thing about the Federal Maritime Commission that I think a lot of people don't understand is they're watching that, right? They really are kind of this competition watching authority, right? Because they're granting limited antitrust exemptions to ports working together. So like LA Long Beach, we say is almost one long name. They are two separate ports that compete against each other. The same way we're seeing these ocean alliances, the different ones, they are competing even within the alliance with each other. But even that agreement is publicly accessible. You can go on the Federal Maritime Commission's website, look up their agreements library and see, well, what are the terms of these vessel sharing agreements? What are the terms of these global alliances? You can see what they say. You can see their expiration terms. All of those things are there. And if it makes you feel better, the FMC, an independent regulatory agency, not an agency of necessarily the administration, an independent regulatory agency, is watching it and making sure that it doesn't get out of control. And so that's where they come in. They have an enforcement arm. They certainly have a monitoring arm. They have a whole slew of economists that are watching all of this. And so they're also making sure that these alliances in their individual alliance capacity are not getting too high of market share. So all of that hopefully makes people feel a little bit better that somebody is watching on the government side, as much as you might want government watching. But the FMC, I feel like, tends to be fair about it. And really, they are there for the protection of the U.S. importer, exporter, and consumer. So is somebody watching?
And that's the exact reason we saw the 2M split, because it was getting too big. Everybody knew Maersk and MSC could not sustain themselves. Someone was going to have to give up something they didn't want to. So you see that fracture. I think, one of the greatest things that came out of the supply chain crisis to me was the increased visibility of the FMC, the increased power to it. You got 5 commissioners serve for 5-year terms. They overlap so that you always have one coming up every year. They go through a Senate confirmation, appointed by the president. So it's different groups on there. You got different backgrounds, a very diverse group that's up there. The knowledge base is amazing. They've finally got some resources that allow them to do it. And again, I think the other thing that this does more than anything else is, I think, raise visibility of shipping and then really how dependent we are on it and why we spend a little bit more time and focus on it. I get really, I understand the Secretary of Transportation wants to talk about air travel because that's what touches most people. He's going to talk about that because, if he's going to run for president, you need to show that you're doing that. But, a quarter of what he does is maritime. You got air, rail, you got road, and then you have maritime. And his focus should be a little bit on that too. And I think this really raises that issue up quite a bit. I had somebody, just got in an argument with telling me, it's like, what do we export from the East Coast that goes do we export anything? These containers are all 100% empty when they leave the US. It's like, no, they're not. It's like, I don't even know how you make that statement. It's like, that's a crazy statement to make.
Yeah.
And
at some point, I was going to say, at some point, this is starting to affect our farmers, right? I mean, because they are relying, some ag products going out are relying on these containers being available to be filled with the goods going out.
Well, and I think that's why too the ILA's got to be careful. You can have a strike for a week in the ports, and it really doesn't affect you on your shelves, except for maybe people panicking and grabbing stuff. But it's after the week that it starts getting tough, especially when you start seeing businesses having to stop production because they're missing key component parts. So you're laying off workers. All of a sudden, you start running low on coffee. Man, if we run out of coffee, we're in trouble as a country, because a lot of people without caffeine will be a grumpy country in the morning.
Grumpy.
and so there's certain things that you want, but again, it really does show. Part of the global. I'm a history professor. I teach business and trade. I talk about the fact that the Mesopotamians are created because they're trading up and down the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Persian Gulf. You find Chinese coins in Pompeii, which was covered with volcanic ash, showing that globalization existed, over 2,000 years ago. So, and trade is good. Trade, it makes our lives more affordable. It brings up the lives of many. If you ever look at the graph of poverty in the world, it's like almost a straight line at 90 something percent for most of history until recently. And then it drops down. It just kind of falls off a cliff. And that is because of the fact that you can ship a container across the Pacific for, you know, $1,500. And if you load it with 1,000 phones on it, that's $1 a phone. It's nothing.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's hope things get scooting soon. Hopefully, by the time this video airs, we will have some sort of resolution because the free flow of goods is a benefit to all, right? And so,
I have no doubt, Lauren, if they put you and me in charge, we'd have this settled in no time. We should be the mediators between the U.S. Maritime Alliance and the ILA. I'm going to put this out there right now. If this strike is not done, call the maritime professors. We will get this straightened out very quickly.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation. Perhaps we'll do a debrief, maybe a further deeper dive on the congestion surcharges or work disruption surcharges, or just generally D&D and all the rules coming out there. But really great conversation today. Thank you, Sal, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I think this is not going to go away anytime soon. I think we can definitely have a conversation about this for a while to come.
That's right. We're just getting started, right? Where the work is just getting started. Even with an agreement in place, there's a lot to unpack still. So, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, the general industry informations and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, maritimeprofessor.com. And make sure to follow Dr. Sal Mercogliano on what's going on with shipping, too. He has a wildly popular YouTube channel. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.